Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Storybook of Science by JEAN-HENRI FABRE, 1823 to 1915. Chapter 1. The Six. One evening at twilight, they were all gathered together, Uncle Paul and his 3 children, Emile, Jules, and Claire. Uncle Paul was reading from a large book. He always found reading to be the best way to unwind after a day of work. Nothing refreshes the mind quite like a good book, he often said, especially one that shares the wisdom of great thinkers and writers. His room was a treasure trove of books, neatly arranged on sturdy pine shelves. There were books of every kind, large and small, illustrated and plain, some with gilded edges, others simply bound. When Uncle Paul shut himself in that room, it took something truly urgent to pull him away from his reading. People often said he knew countless stories and had a talent for noticing the small wonders around him. In the garden, he could often be seen stopping by the beehives to watch the bees hum, or standing under the elder bush, where tiny flowers fell like snowflakes. He would even stoop to examine a tiny insect or a blade of grass just sprouting from the ground. Whatever he observed, it seemed to bring him immense joy, as if he had uncovered one of nature's secrets. Later, when he shared his discoveries, everyone felt inspired, and they learned things that might one day prove useful. Uncle Paul was a kind and God-fearing man, respected by everyone in the village. They called him Mater Paul because of his wisdom, which he freely shared with all. Though he was well versed in books, Uncle Paul was equally skilled in farming. He managed his small estate with the help of Jacques and Mother Ambrosine, a devoted couple who had served his family for years. Jacques worked the fields and cared for the animals, while Ambrosine kept the house running smoothly. They were more than just servants. They were like family. Paul had grown up under their care, and they still reminisced about the times Jacques made willow whistles to cheer him up, or when Ambrosine slipped a hard-boiled egg into his lunch to coax him to school without tears. Despite living alone, Uncle Paul's happiest moments were spent with children. He had convinced his brother to let his 3 children stay with him part of the year. Claire, the eldest at nearly 12, was thoughtful and hard-working. She knit stockings, hemmed handkerchiefs, and studied diligently without worrying about what she'd wear on Sundays. She was always ready to help, doing whatever was asked for her without complaint. Jules was 2 years younger, a whirlwind of energy. He had an insatiable curiosity, asking endless questions about everything that caught his eye, from ants carrying straws to sparrows chirping on the roof. Uncle Paul appreciated his inquisitiveness, but was mindful of Jules' fiery temper, which flared up when things didn't go his way. Still, he believed gentle guidance would help Jules grow into a kind and thoughtful young man. Then there was Emile, the youngest, a bundle of mischief and boundless energy. He was always getting into scrapes, whether it was smearing his face with berries, bumping his head, or pricking his finger with a thorn. His greatest joy was his box of toys, filled with spinning tops, toy soldiers, a miniature Noah's Ark, and a forbidden trumpet. Yet even Emile was beginning to show signs of curiosity, asking his uncle questions and paying more attention to the world around him. Perhaps, Uncle Paul thought, he might soon trade his toys for stories and discoveries. Chapter 2. The Fairy Tale and the True Story. The 6 of them were gathered together. Uncle Paul was engrossed in a thick book. Jacques was busy braiding a wicker basket, and Mother Ambrosine was working steadily with her distaff. Claire was stitching linen with red thread, while Emile and Jules played with a Noah's Ark set. After carefully arranging the animals in a procession, lining the horse after the camel, the dog after the horse, then the sheep, donkey, ox, lion, elephant, bear, gazelle, and many others, Emile and Jules grew bored. They turned to Mother Ambrosine. "Tell us a story, Mother Ambrosine, something fun," they said. Mother Ambrosine, with the simplicity of her age, smiled and began to spin her tale while twirling her spindle. Once upon a time, a grasshopper and an ant went to the fair. The river was frozen solid. The grasshopper jumped across the ice with ease, but the ant struggled. "Carry me on your shoulders," the ant pleaded. "I'm so small, you won't even notice." But the grasshopper replied, "Why don't you jump like I did?" The ant tried, but it slipped and broke its leg. "Ice, ice, the strong should be kind," the ant cried, "but you've broken my leg, my poor little leg." Then the ice said, "The sun is stronger than I, it melts me." "Sun, sun, the strong should be kind," the ant continued, "but you melted the ice, which broke my leg." The sun answered, "The clouds are stronger than me, they hide me." "Clouds, clouds, the strong should be kind," the ant said, "but you hide the sun, which melted the ice that broke my leg." The clouds replied, "The wind is stronger, it drives us away." "Wind, wind, the strong should be kind," the ant repeated, "but you drive away the clouds, which hide the sun, which melted the ice that broke my leg." And so it went, Mother Ambrosine continued, until the walls stopped the wind, the rat gnawed through the walls, the cat chased the rat. "But it's the same thing, over and over again," Jules interrupted, frustrated. "Not quite, my child. After the cat comes the broom that strikes it, then the fire that burns the broom, then the water that puts out the fire, and so on. Each has its turn," she said with a knowing smile. "Does it ever end?" Emile asked, tired of the repetition. "It ends when you want it to," Mother Ambrosine replied. "The lesson is clear. No matter how strong one may be, there's always someone stronger." "That's exhausting," Emile said with a sigh. "Do you have another story?" "Of course. Once upon a time, there was a poor woodcutter and his wife who had 7 children. The youngest was so tiny that he slept in a wooden shoe." "I know that story," Emile interrupted again. "It's Hop o' My Thumb. He marks the way with pebbles, then breadcrumbs. The bird eats the crumbs, the kids get lost, and they find an ogre's house." "Fairy tales aren't real," Jules said with a shrug. "I prefer true stories." At this, Uncle Paul closed his book and looked up. "I agree," he said. "True stories are not only more fascinating, but also more valuable. They show us the wonders of the real world, which are far more incredible than ogres and fairies." Mother Ambrosine's story of the ant may not have held your interest, but perhaps I can share something better. Who wants to hear a story about real ants? "I do!" exclaimed Emile, Jules, and Claire all at once. Chapter 3. The Building of the City. "They're diligent workers," began Uncle Paul. "Many times, when the morning sun starts to warm the earth, I've enjoyed watching the activity around their small mounds of soil, each with a hole at the top for coming and going. Some emerge from the depths of this hole, followed by others, and more after that. Each carries a tiny grain of earth in its jaws, a heavy load for such a small creature. When they reach the top of the mound, they drop their burden, letting it roll down the slope, and immediately head back down into the hole. They don't pause to play or chat with their companions. Oh no, the work is urgent and there's so much to do. Each ant arrives, focused, deposits its grain of soil, and goes back for more. But why are they so busy? They're constructing an underground city, complete with streets, rooms, storehouses, and even sleeping quarters. They dig into the soil, carving out tunnels and chambers deep enough to stay safe from the rain. These tunnels connect to streets, crisscrossing in all directions, some sloping up, others down, leading to larger communal halls. All of this is done painstakingly, grain by grain, using nothing but their jaws. If anyone could see this hidden army of miners working in the darkness, they'd be amazed. There are thousands of them, tirelessly digging, scraping, and carrying away the soil. Their patience and effort are extraordinary. When they finally free a grain of sand, they march out triumphantly, heads held high despite the weight of their load. I've watched some ants struggle under the enormous burdens, wobbling under the strain but determined to reach the top. They weave among their companions almost as if to say, "Look how hard I'm working." And honestly, you can't blame them. There's a certain pride in good, honest work. Over time, these grains pile up at the entrance to their city, forming the mound we see. The bigger the mound, the larger the underground city they're building. But digging is only part of the job. The tunnels need to be reinforced to prevent collapses. Weak spots are strengthened, ceilings are propped up with tiny pillars, and walls are partitioned. For this, the miners are joined by carpenters. While the miners carry soil, the carpenters bring building materials, tiny bits of straw, leaves, and other sturdy pieces. A small straw might become a ceiling beam, while a dry leaf stem could serve as a pillar. These carpenters venture into the surrounding forests, or what we'd call patches of grass, to find their materials. Look at this oat husk. It's dry, solid, and perfect for building a partition. But it's heavy, far too heavy for one ant. The first ant tries, pulling with all its strength, trembling from the effort. When it realizes the load is too much, does it give up? Not a chance. Soon it returns with 2 helpers. Together they pull and push, slowly but surely moving the husk toward the entrance. Even when they face obstacles, other ants passing by lend a hand, and eventually the piece reaches the city. But now comes the hard part. It doesn't fit through the entrance. More ants gather, inspecting the problem like little engineers. They figure out a solution. The husk needs to be flipped so its point goes in first. Carefully, they adjust their positions, tipping the husk just right, and finally, it slides into the tunnel. It's teamwork at its finest. And yet, the miners don't stop to admire this feat of engineering. No, they keep marching with their grains of soil, single-minded in their work. It's incredible dedication. Of course, all that hard work builds up an appetite. Thankfully, there are milkmaid ants who bring food. They've just milked their cows and now distribute the milk to the workers. At this, Emil burst out laughing. Milkmaid ants? Cows? Milk? That's a fairy tale, Uncle Paul, just like Mother Ambrosine's stories. Emil wasn't alone in his surprise. Mother Ambrosine paused her spinning. Jack stopped weaving his basket, and Jules and Claire stared with wide eyes, thinking it must be a joke. "No, my dears," said Uncle Paul with a smile. "I'm not joking. There really are milkmaid ants and cows. But explaining that will take some time, so we'll continue the story tomorrow." Emil pulled Jules aside and whispered, "Uncle's true stories are way more fun than Mother Ambrosine's tales. I'd give up my Noah's Ark just to hear more about those amazing cows." Chapter 4. The Cows. The next morning, as Emil was just waking up, he remembered the ants' cows and couldn't stop thinking about them. "We should ask Uncle to tell us the rest of the story," he said to Jules. Without wasting time, they went to find their uncle. "Aha!" Uncle Paul exclaimed when they made their request. "So the ants' cows have captured your interest. I'll do more than just tell you about them. I'll show them to you. But first, call Claire to join us." Claire arrived quickly, curious to see what was happening. Their uncle led them into the garden, stopping under the elder bush. "Look carefully," he said. The bush was in full bloom, its flowers white and vibrant. Bees, flies, beetles, and butterflies flitted from one flower to another, their buzzing creating a soft, steady hum. On the trunk of the elder, ants scurried up and down the bark. Some climbed eagerly upward, while others came back down more leisurely. The ants going up seemed full of energy. Occasionally, they paused to ask the descending ants something, as if gathering news about what lay ahead. Upon learning, they continued climbing, their enthusiasm renewed. The ants coming down moved slowly, with noticeable bulges in their abdomens. It was clear that these ants had been feasting and were now heading back home. "What are they eating up there?" asked Jules, pointing that some of the ants could barely move. "Oh, they're such gluttons." "Not gluttons," Uncle Paul corrected him. "They're gathering food for their colony. Up on the elder bush, there are countless cows that they milk. The ants you see coming down are carrying that milk in their stomachs to share with the ant colony. Let me show you what I mean." Uncle Paul bent a branch down to their level. The children leaned in and saw something remarkable. The underside of the leaves and the tender new branches were covered in tiny black insects, packed so closely together that they seemed like a velvet carpet. These insects, called plant lice or aphids, were motionless, feeding on the sap of the elder through their hair-thin suckers. At the end of their bodies, they had two tiny tube-like structures. From these tubes, small droplets of a sugary liquid occasionally appeared. "These are the ants' cows," Uncle Paul explained. "The tubes are their udders, and the sugary liquid is the milk." As they watched, ants moved purposefully among the aphids. When one spotted a droplet, it eagerly drank it and seemed to savor every bit. "Oh, how delicious," the children imagined the ants thinking. But when the aphids were stingy and didn't produce any liquid, the ants didn't give up. Instead, they gently stroked the aphid's body and tickled their milk tubes with their antennae, coaxing them to release the prized droplets. More often than not, the ants succeeded. Uncle Paul released the branch, and it sprang back into place, carrying the tiny milkmaids, their cattle, and the pasture back to the top of the bush. "That's incredible, Uncle," Claire exclaimed. "It truly is, Claire," Uncle Paul agreed, "and it's not just the elderbush. The ants tend their cows on many other plants. Aphids on rose bushes and cabbages are green. On elder, beans, and nettles, they're black. On oaks and thistles, bronze-colored. And on oleanders and walnuts, yellow. They all have those tiny tubes, and they all provide the ants with their sweet milk." As Uncle Paul and Claire returned indoors, Emile and Jules, inspired by what they had just learned, set out to find more aphids on other plants. Within an hour, they had discovered 4 different types, all of which had ants visiting them, though clearly not out of pure friendliness. Chapter 5. The Pasture. In the evening, Uncle Paul continued the story about ants. At that time, Jacques usually went to check the stables to see if the oxen were eating their fodder and if the well-fed lambs were sleeping peacefully beside their mothers. However, under the pretense of putting the final touches on his wicker basket, Jacques stayed where he was. The truth about the ants' cows had captured his curiosity. Uncle Paul went into detail about what they had observed that morning on the elder tree, how the plant life secreted sugary drops from their tubes, how the ants eagerly drank the sweet liquid, and how they coaxed it out with gentle caresses when needed. "What you're telling us, Master," Jacques said, "warms my old heart. It reminds me of how God looks after his creatures, giving the plant louse to the ant just as he gives cows to humans. Now, back to my story. If our cows roamed freely in the countryside, and we had to journey far to milk them in the distant pastures with no guarantee we'd even find them, life would be much harder. So what do? We keep them close by in enclosures or stables. Ants sometimes use the same strategy with plant lice. To avoid long, uncertain journeys, they create pens or shelters for the herds. Not all ants are this resourceful, of course, and even if they were, it would be impossible to build an enclosure big enough for all their cattle and pastures. For instance, how could they wall in the willow tree we saw this morning, teeming with black lice? But when conditions are manageable, like a tuft of grass with a small herd at its base, they can build a sheepfold. Jules, if you look carefully in the summer, you might find one at the base of potted plants. You can count on me, Uncle, said Jules. I want to see these remarkable ant shelters, but you haven't explained why ants overeat themselves when they find a herd of plant lice. You mentioned earlier that the ones descending the elder tree with swollen stomachs are heading back to share the food. A foraging ant will, of course, eat its fill if the opportunity arises. It's only fair. After all, you need strength to work for others. Sadly, among humans, that's not always the case. There are those who, once well fed, assume everyone else has eaten too. Such people are called selfish, and may you never earn that label. Even the smallest ant would be ashamed of it. Once it's satisfied, the ant thinks of its hungry companions. It stores liquid food in its stomach and heads back to the colony. Along the way, it meets another ant, perhaps a carpenter busy with a straw. They greet face to face, almost like a kiss. The foraging ant releases a tiny drop of its stored liquid, and the carpenter eagerly drinks. Refreshed, the carpenter returns to its work, while the milk carrier continues its route, feeding other ants it encounters. This process repeats until the forager's stomach is empty, and it heads back out to refill it. Now, imagine the effort required to feed so many workers in this way. One milk ant isn't enough. There must be an entire team of foragers. And underground, in the colony's warm nurseries, there's another group of hungry mouths, the larvae, the next generation of ants. One day, Emile interrupted, I lifted a stone and saw a lot of little white grains that the ants were quickly carrying away. Those weren't grains, Uncle Paul explained. They were eggs. The ants had brought them to the surface to warm them in the sun and speed up hatching. When you lifted the stone, they rushed to carry them back to safety. When the eggs hatch, the young ants don't look like ants at all. They're tiny white worms, helpless and immobile. Thousands of these larvae fill the dormitories, and the adult ants tirelessly feed them, one mouthful at a time, until they grow and transform into full-fledged ants. Just think about how much work this requires and how many plant lice must be milked to sustain the colony.